Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the amazing and impressive co-leader catalogue from the one and only legendary pianist, composer and bandleader, Keith Jarrett. So throughout Keith Jarrett's legendary career, he has put out a number of different albums, whether it's from his Standards trio with Gary Peacock and Jack DeJohnette, or his European Quartet with Jan Garbarek, Palle Danielsson and Jan Christensen, or his American Quartet with Charlie Haden, Dewey Redman and Paul Motian, or his solo piano albums, or his classical albums. Keith Jarrett is always putting out a variety of different projects, but the one aspect of his legendary career that doesn't really get talked about that much and has rarely been touched upon is, of course, his co-leader albums, where he's featured and playing in a duo environment with a fellow musician. And when you go through Keith Jarrett's legendary career, the co-leader duo albums are very few and far between, especially when you've been around as long as Keith Jarrett has, and he has played with some of the most important figures in music. The co-leader duo albums are few and far between, especially when you compare it to someone like Pat Metheny, who has released a number of different duo albums with a number of different musicians. But with Keith Jarrett, there's not really that many as you think. Keith Jarrett, of course, released the classic Mozart album with Chick Corea. He also recorded and released a duo album with Gary Burton. But when you put it all together, it's really not as many as you'd think, which is quite surprising for someone like Keith Jarrett. So for today's special edition, I am going to be taking a look at Keith Jarrett's co-leader albums, which are handpicked by me, and these ones are the ones I feel that are the most important, and these are the ones that really showcase different sides to Keith Jarrett's musical personality, because I've always said, and I still stand by this, that Keith Jarrett is at his best playing solo piano. But interestingly enough, when you hear Keith Jarrett in a duo environment, he completely changes the way he plays. His piano playing is a lot more subdued, it's a lot more laid back, a lot more lush, and it's a real nice and rare treat to hear Keith Jarrett in this sort of setting, bouncing off different ideas and notes with a fellow musician, just the two of them. So it's quite a nice and rare treat. And when Keith Jarrett wants to, he can be a team player. And to hear him in a duo environment, it's just magical. So I've decided to handpick 4 albums that I feel are the most important and the ones that really showcase Keith Jarrett at his best in a duo environment. And I can honestly tell you now, none of these albums are bad. They're all excellent. Some are legendary, some are underrated, and one of them is kind of unknown. But as I said, you get to hear a different side to Keith Jarrett's playing in this environment, and this is some top-notch stuff from perhaps the greatest piano player of all time. So, as always, I am going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one, which, quite frankly, is not an easy task. But, as I said, any of these albums could easily be the best. There's no bad albums here. I think they're all excellent. So, we're going to start with the first co-leader album, and this one came out in 1994, and this one is called J.S. Bach 3 Sonatas for Viola da Gamba and Harpsichord. So this is a duo album featuring Keith Jarrett on harpsichord and Kim Kashkashian on viola. And this sees the two of them performing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. And Keith Jarrett, of course, is no stranger to Bach's material. He has put out a number of different classical albums throughout his legendary career, playing the music of Bach, whether it's on harpsichord or on piano. Keith Jarrett and Bach pretty much go together very well, and he is on top form here playing harpsichord. And Kim Kashkashian delivers amazing playing on the viola, and the harpsichord and the viola work very well together. Jarrett and Kashkashian, it's just magical, and they really work well. The chemistry and the musicianship between these two is on full display, and they really work wonders together. And as I said earlier, it's a rare treat to hear Keith Jarrett in a duo environment, but when we do see him in this sort of setting, it's magic. And, you know, to hear Keith Jarrett now playing the music of Bach with another fellow musician, this one coming from the classical world, you know it's going to be good and you know it's going to be special. And I can't think of anyone who's more suited for this sort of music than the lovely Kim Kashkashian. She's a remarkable musician and she's just a great player, and she just really works her magic on the viola. And Keith Jarrett, of course, for anyone who knows, he's put out some lovely harpsichord albums throughout his career. So let's have a look, shall we? So there's the track listing, as you can see. So we got the Sonata G major and Sonata D major and Sonata G minor. So Sonata G major is made up of four parts, and Sonata D major is made up of four parts, and Sonata G minor is made up of three parts. And a lot of the tracks are, they're quite short. They're all clocking in at 3 to 4 minutes, some like under a minute. So they're all quite relatively short pieces. And there's a little bit of background about the viola and harpsichord. And a little bit of there as well. And some more there as well. And there's Keith Jarrett and Kim Kashkashian. Looking like they're having a lot of fun. And it's pretty much the same as earlier, but it's all in German. But it's a very lovely album. Highly recommended for all classical fans. If you like the music of Bach, you can't go wrong with Keith Jarrett and Kim Kashkashian. They're as good as they get, and they just work magic together in this setting. I wouldn't like to say what's the standout tracks because they're all like in suites, but the entire album from top to bottom is just excellent, and you can't go wrong with these two incredible musicians. So there you have it, Keith Jarrett and Kim Kashkashian, J.S. Bach, three sonatas for viola da gamba and harpsichord. A beautiful album and a great treat to hear Keith Jarrett in a duo setting. Tremendous stuff. Love this album. So we move on to the next co-leader album, and this one came out in 2010, and this one is called Jasmine. So Jasmine features Keith Jarrett on piano and Charlie Haden on bass, and this is the first time in many years that Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden had played together, both former bandmates and members of Keith Jarrett's American Quartet. And as great as they sounded together in the American Quartet, Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden in a duo environment is just magic, and it doesn't get any better than that. And Charlie Haden, for me, he is right at home in this sort of setting, and he's got such a rich and unique way of playing in this environment. He's not what you would call a ferocious and aggressive bass player. He has a very simplistic approach to the way he plays, and he brings that laid back feel to the music, and you put him with Keith Jarrett. As I said, it's just absolutely magic, and they really bring out the best in one another and really take their playing and take it to very different places. And it's just very warm. It's a lot of warmth. There's a lot of love, you name it, it's all there. And it's such a very feel good album, shall I say. It feels so good hearing Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden playing together. you know, you wouldn't even have known that these two hadn't played together in years. They just sounded like they played the day before. And that's a true testament to the ability and musicianship of Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden. I love them in the quartet, but I love them even more in a duo environment. And it's just absolutely remarkable. So we're going to have a quick look. There's the tracks. So most of the tracks on this album are standards, apart from one original by Keith Jarrett. And the choice of material for this album, you know, Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden, they could make 100 of these albums and they would all sound great. And it's just excellence. It really is. So there's a little bit about the history between Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden and how this project came together. There's a nice picture of the two gentlemen themselves and a bit more about the history of these two. And there's the production notes as well. And as I said, it's just magic between Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden. So tracks we got here are For All We Know by J. Fred Coots and Samuel M. Lewis, Where Can I Go Without You by Peggy Lee and Victor Young, No Moon at All by Red Evans and David A. Mann, One Day I'll Fly Away by Joe Sample and Will Jennings, Intro by Keith Jarrett, I'm Gonna Laugh You Right Out of My Life by C.Y. Coleman and Joseph McCarthy, Body and Soul by Jimmy Green and Edward Heyman, Frank Yeaton and Robert Sauer, Goodbye by Gordon Jenkins, and Don't Ever Leave Me by Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein. So some excellent choices of standards, and it's just a beautiful album. It really is, and a very special album. And the standout tracks for me are For All We Know, Where Can I Go Without You, Intro, I'm Gonna Laugh You Right Out of My Life, Goodbye, and Don't Ever Leave Me. Such a beautiful album. And Charlie Haden, of course, is no stranger to the duo environment. He's played in duo with Brad Mildew, Pat Metheny, Jim Hall, you name it. He's played in all these different situations with all different musicians. But I think Charlie Haden and Keith Jarrett together, it's just gold. It really is. And it's such a beautiful album. So there you have it. Jasmine by Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden. Probably my all-time favourite album out of the co-leader catalogue of Keith Jarrett. Just a beautiful album, in my opinion. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next co-leader album, and this one came out in 2013, and it's a double album, and this one is called Johann Sebastian Bach Six Sonatas for Violin and Piano. So this features Keith Jarrett on piano and Michelle Makarski on violin. So very similar to the album that Keith Jarrett made with Kim Kashkashian, but that was more for harpsichord and viola. This time Keith Jarrett is on piano and Michelle Makarski is on violin. So there are some similarities. Both albums, of course, feature Bach material, but just different instruments. Keith Jarrett right at home on piano, playing the music of Bach with a fellow musician from a classical background, and it's just pure magic. It doesn't get any better than this. And Michelle Makarski is a very different player to Kim Kashkashian. Kim Kashkashian is more of a viola player, and Michelle McCaskey is more of a violin player. But the similarities between the instruments, are not that much different, but it's just you get kind of a different sound. And the piano and the violin together is just beautiful, and you can never ever go wrong in a classical environment with these two instruments. And when you have two musicians the caliber of Keith Jarrett and Michelle McCaskey, doesn't get any better than that. And they really push each other and take their playing to new heights, and they just sound fantastic together. They really do. And Keith Jarrett, in the duo environments, right at home. What more can I say? It's not an area he explores much, but when he does venture into it, it's just magic, as I mentioned before. Doesn't get any better than that. So we're just going to have a quick look. There's the track listing. So on disc 1, we've got 3 suites, all made up of 4 parts. Sonata number 1 in B minor, Sonata number 2 in A major, Sonata number 3 in E major, and then on disc 2, which is also made up of 3 suites, Sonata number 4 in C minor is 4 parts, Sonata number 5 in F minor is 4 parts, and Sonata number 6 in G major is 5 parts. And a lot of the tracks are quite fairly short-ish, around about 3 to 4 minutes to 2 minutes long. The longest track on here is on disc 2, which is like 8 minutes, and the shortest track is like 1 minute and 45 seconds. So a lot of the pieces are like relatively short. So there they are, working their magic. And there they are as well. Nice shot of the lovely Michelle McCaskey and the man himself. So there's no real standout tracks as such. You just have to really listen to all 6 suites in their entirety to really appreciate the music and get the full experience. But it's a lovely album. It's in the classical realm, and it's just excellent. It's a really good album, and certainly up there with the duo album that Keith Jarrett made with Kim Kashkashian years earlier. Excellent stuff, must say. Highly recommended for all classical fans. If you want to hear Keith Jarrett in a duo environment playing the music of Bach, this is definitely the one to check out. So there you have it, Johann Sebastian Bach, 6 sonatas for violin and piano by Keith Jarrett and Michelle McCaskey. Beautiful album, and certainly up there with Keith Jarrett's classical works. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next co-leader album, and this one came out in 2014. And this album is probably the most special album of the entire Keith Jarrett's co-leader catalogue. And the title for this one is only fitting because the musician that is featured on this one would pass away not too long after. So this one makes it even more special from an emotional point of view. And this one is called Last Dance. So this is a follow-up to Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden's Jasmine album from 2010. And it was pure magic. It was a lovely album, so it made perfect sense to release another one. And as I mentioned earlier, Charlie Haden would pass away not too long after this album was released. So it was only fitting that these two would hook up one more time to deliver another beautiful album. And it's just pure magic. Keith Jarrett on piano and Charlie Haden on bass. Doesn't get any better than that in a duo environment, and it just seems only fitting for Charlie Haden to go out with essentially probably his most iconic collaborator. I certainly put Keith Jarrett up there with Pat Metheny in terms of importance, but Pat Metheny and Charlie Haden, they've got a lot of history, but Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden, they've just got legendary history, so it just makes perfect sense for Charlie Haden to do this album in this environment, and it's a beautiful album, equally as good as Jasmine. So we'll just have a quick look. Into the track listing. So pretty much the same as Jasmine, and it mentions here that some of them are alternate takes from the Jasmine sessions, but just done in a different way. So we got My Old Flame by Arthur Johnston and Sam Coslow, My Ship by Kurt Welly and Ira Gershwin, Round Midnight by Thelonious Monk and Cootie Williams, Dance of the Infidels by Bud Powell, It Might As Well Be Spring by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, Everything Happens to Me by Thomas Adair and Matt Dennis, and the two alternate takes from Jasmine are Where Can I Go Without You by Victor Young and Peggy Lee, and Goodbye by Gordon Jenkins, and Every Time We Say Goodbye by Carl Porter. Excellent choice of songs, mostly standards, but what Haden and Jarrett do together is they take the standards and just turn it into works of art, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And the standout tracks for me are My Old Flame, My Ship, Round Midnight, Everything Happens to Me, Where Can I Go Without You, Every Time We Say Goodbye, and Goodbye. Excellent album, pure magic. Jarrett on piano, Charlie Haden on bass, working the magic, just tremendous stuff. And I like to think that Jarrett and Haden have got more like this tucked away in the vaults, so I definitely would love to hear more. But a fitting title, Last Dance, what a way to go out for Charlie Haden, one of the greatest bass players of all time, and playing in the duo environment with his American Quartet bandmate Keith Jarrett. Doesn't get any better than this. So there you have it. Last Dance by Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden. A fitting way to end their legendary collaboration. Tremendous stuff. Love it. So which Keith Jarrett's co-leader album do I think is the best one? Well, as I said at the beginning, I chose these four because I feel that these were the ones that really showcased Keith Jarrett's piano playing in a duo setting, and I feel these ones are the most important. And they're all good, they're all excellent. You know, there's no bad album. Obviously, there are a couple that are a little bit better than others, but as I said earlier, that they're all different. They don't all sound the same. They all have their own unique personality. But if I had to choose one which I think is the best one, I'm definitely going with Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden, Jasmine. I just think for these two to come together once again after not playing together for many years and to put out an album like this doesn't get any better than that. Charlie Haden, as I said earlier, right at home in this environment, playing in an unplugged duo environment, and Keith Jarrett, he just sounds incredible and is on top form. So for me, this is the best one, and it's probably my all-time favourite Keith Jarrett's co-leader album. It's just fantastic and a lovely album. So there you have it, Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden. For me, the best co-leader album from Keith Jarrett and my all-time favourite. Absolutely love this one so much. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Keith Jarrett's co-leader album? Is it J.S. Bach, Three Sonatas for Viola, da Gamba and Harpsichord by Keith Jarrett and Kim Kashkashkin? Or is it Jasmine by Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden? Johann Sebastian Bach, Six Sonatas for Violin and Piano by Keith Jarrett and Michelle Makarski? Or is it Last Dance by Keith Jarrett and Charlie Haden? There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below. And I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, Take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.